Good morning, I'm Dave Christie with your LaRouche Organization Daily Update for Monday, October 20th. Now, as you may have seen either on this platform or even in some of the mainstream media, the Bering Strait connection concept is on the table in a big way. That followed a series of tweets by the head of, ex-posts, by the head of Russia's direct investment fund, Kirill Dmitriev. Dmitriev has been negotiating U.S.-Russia relations together with Steve Witkoff over the recent period. But anyway, Dmitriev had a series of posts on the Bering Strait connection idea, and that also came up in the Trump-Zelensky meeting on Friday. So I'll come back to some of that, but obviously this is one of the flagship concepts of a peace through development approach. Certainly what Helga Tsep-LaRouche has been calling for, particularly in the context of the tensions in Southwest Gaza concerning the Southwest Asia, that is, concerning the situation between Israel and Gaza. The Oasis plan also is of that quality and is the only way to bring a true and lasting peace, and are the types of mega projects that can reorient the global economy away from the collapse of the transatlantic system and bring the nations of the United States and Western Europe into the new paradigm that is unfolding on the planet. So again, I'll come back to some of the developments around that, but I think just to cover it briefly, we do have the ongoing accusations being traded between the Israeli leadership and Hamas surrounding the violations of the ceasefire. That certainly was to be expected. Netanyahu and some of his more belligerent and pro-genocidal crowd within Israel effectively said that they weren't intending to keep the ceasefire going, or at least the longer-term peace negotiations going, resulting in a two-state solution and so forth. But so anyway, we saw that there was accusations that Hamas had violated the ceasefire, and Israel launched a wave of bombing in southern Gaza, Rafah and Khan Yunis, apparently resulting in 45 people being killed, according to the Hamas Emergency Services organization. Now, in the midst of these tensions, Netanyahu said that the Rafah Gate, which is one of the key transit openings for the delivery of aid and so forth, that would be closed, and cited the need for Hamas to return the remaining 18 bodies of the hostages that were deceased. So obviously that's an extremely difficult task, given that many of these bodies are lying under rubble and probably difficult to locate. Now, in the middle of all of this, apparently Trump is sending J.D. Vance to bolster the team that he had already planned, which was Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They were already slated to go to Israel to ensure that Israel keeps up with their side of the ceasefire agreement. But apparently that, again, J.D. Vance will be joining them as to kind of upgrade the negotiating team. So I think Vance will be getting there tomorrow and will join Witkoff and Kushner, as I mentioned. So now, for some of the back and forth on this, I think you should go to the writings of Gershon Baskin. He's been leading the negotiations, or has been involved in the negotiations, and he has had a series of posts on what needs to be done to ensure that this is a success and so on. He's also somebody that has a sense of the International Peace Coalition and the work of Helga Tsep-LaRouche, having participated in some of those meetings. So I'll refer you to his writings and obviously EIR to get a sense of some of these developments as they move forward. Now, on the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, Donald Trump weighed into this last night aboard Air Force One late Sunday night. He said effectively that the ceasefire was still in place. He referred to Hamas as being quite rambunctious, but thinks that the leadership, that is the leadership of Hamas, isn't involved in that. So that's at least where that stands. But again, I think just to return to the core of it, that this ceasefire and the ensuing next phases of the peace deal are not going to function unless there is the accompanying cooperation around what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has put on the table with the Oasis Plan. In other words, you cannot have peace without development, and that obviously is not just between Israel and Palestine. It's ultimately for the region as a whole, to green the deserts from northern Africa to western China and all the way over to India. This is the kind of project that could be initiated and bring in the type of regional integration, including ultimately through the development corridors expressed by the Belt and Road Initiative. So that has to be the ultimate function, or the ultimate way that this is going to truly be resolved in terms of peace in the region. Now, okay, so I want to come back to the Bering Strait connection, because obviously this is a huge breakthrough and concept, and we have to drive it forward. I'll refer you to the discussions that was had in the Manhattan meeting, the Manhattan Dialogue on Saturday, that you can find on the LaRouche Organization site, because I think some of the core conceptual issues were taken up in that discussion. Now, one of the correspondents joining Harley Schlanger and Dennis Speed was Alex Craner, who is a geopolitical financial analyst. He has his own analytics company and so forth. Anyway, Alex Craner, I think, brought up a relevant point that goes to the detonator for the global geopolitical crisis, which is the financial collapse. Now, he brought up the issue of the Rockefeller plans for Venezuela, and did it from this standpoint, which is that following 9/11, apparently there are different people within the media that cited that they had discussions with people connected to the Rockefeller apparatus, saying that following 9/11, in addition to the endless war scenario for Southwest Asia, that Venezuela was also on the target list. Now, what Kreiner said in that discussion on Saturday was that effectively this was to grab the loot, the oil of Venezuela, not necessarily to develop it and so on, because that could be done through business transactions and so forth, but rather to grab the oil as an asset base for collateral for further issuance of financial instruments. And I think this is important because this is ultimately what underlies the operation in Russia, is to go in, not even necessarily to develop the resources, because again, that could be done through joint projects and so forth, but rather to grab the collateral of the resource base of Russia after it's broken up and balkanized, which is the plans of the British and their fellow thinkers in the City of London crowd and Wall Street and those within the European financial capitals. But it's the same concept that we've seen over and over, which is you use these assets for collateral to then issue new forms of effectively debt, and that this has been the basis of the system that is now collapsing. So we need a new system, given that the collapse is underway, as people have seen with the bankruptcy or the tricolor bankruptcy. There was also the tremors in the regional banks that we saw last week. So the collapse is the detonator of the geopolitical crisis, and I think that the only way to deal with it is through cooperative arrangements around mega projects such as the Bering Strait project. Now, as I mentioned, Kirill Dmitriev raised this last week in a series of X posts. And actually, Trump was asked about the project in his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday, to which Trump just sort of responded, "Oh, it's an interesting idea," and then asked Zelensky what he thought. And obviously, predictably, Zelensky said he wasn't very excited about that because he had been there to secure the Tomahawk deliveries, missile deliveries to Ukraine, which really wouldn't have any effect on the battlefield. There's all kinds of complications with how they could actually be launched and so forth. And obviously they have the capability of carrying nuclear weapons, but perhaps not in the form that could be delivered to Ukraine. Anyway, there's all kinds of these issues, but obviously that attempt presently has failed. Trump has made various statements that we need them for our own defense, nor is he's not interested in escalating the war. Now, the Trump-Zelensky meeting occurred the day after Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had a nearly 2.5-hour phone call discussing, I'm sure, a lot, but I'm sure that Putin raised the issue of the Tomahawk delivery, that this would disrupt U.S.-Russia relations and end the light at the end of the tunnel, which, of course, Putin has made numerous references to since the Anchorage summit. Now, perhaps that could be certainly a reference to the Bering Strait tunnel project. And I think, just to cite it, what Dmitriev sent out, that is, again, the head of the Russia Direct Investment Fund and the one of the leading negotiators together with Witkoff on U.S.-Russia relations, his ex-posts on the Bering Strait connection idea included a reference to the a document that came out of the recently released files on the JFK assassination that Russia has given through the embassy there to Representative Anna Paulina Luna. I think she's out of Florida. Anyway, in those files, there was a hand-drawn map of the Bering Strait connection, which had the words, "Kennedy-Khrushchev World Peace Bridge could and should be built between Alaska and Russia at once." Now, we don't know exactly who drew the map, who wrote the piece on the side, handwritten again. But of course, many people would be surprised to know that at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, this was being discussed clearly by the circles of Kennedy, and obviously with the Russians as well. Now, as readers of EIR would know, that this goes back even further than the 1960s. This goes back to the time of Abraham Lincoln. Certain among his advisors were promoting this idea of the Bering Strait connection. On the Russian side, you had Dmitry Mendeleev, who was one of the big proponents of that, not only as the creator of the periodic table of elements, he was a statesman as well, and wanted this Arctic development to unlock the resource-rich region that is the Arctic area. Now, in addition, since in the recent period, Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Zepp-LaRouche have absolutely championed this concept. In April of 2007, there was a conference convened by Russia's Council for the Study of Productive Forces, which was titled Mega Projects of Russia's East, a Transcontinental Eurasia-America Transport Link via the Bering Strait. And LaRouche gave a paper to that conference entitled "The World's Political Map Changes, Mendeleev Would Have Agreed." And I'll just read from part of it. He says, "The development of a great network of modern successors to old forms of rail transport must be spread across continental Eurasia and across the Bering Strait into the Americas. The economically efficient development of presently barren and otherwise forbidding regions in entry into the urgently needed future development of the planet as a whole." And he goes on to say that the bridging of the Bering Strait becomes thus now the navel of a new birth of a new world economy. Now, since 2007, we had in 2013 the announcement by the Chinese that they were pursuing the Belt and Road Initiative, what they initially called a New Silk Road, or parts of the maritime was called that. And since there was actually a grand prize at the World Expo 2010 in Shanghai, which was part of the papers delivered at this earlier conference. It won the grand prize for this conference in Shanghai. And then later in 2014, Professor Wang Mengshu of the Chinese Academy of Engineering stated that China and Russia were discussing its implementation. So in other words, a year after the Belt and Road Initiative had been launched, there was already discussions of the Bering Strait connection between Russia and China. Now, what needs to happen is the United States needs to join these discussions. We certainly would recommend that at the potential upcoming meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump at the APEC summit, that indeed that be discussed, that the entire vast resources, and some people say as much as 40% of global resources, or at least some of the global resources, 40% of them are up in this Arctic region. That's even what we know of them, so perhaps more. But anyway, the relevant point is that these resources would be required for the future development of mankind, but more importantly, open up the development corridors and brings the Americas into the Afro-Eurasian development. That's how Dmitriev actually said it. He said the Americas could be linked to the Afro-Eurasian landmass, and that indeed could happen through the Bering Strait and open up these development corridors for the future of mankind. Now, Putin may not be there at the APEC summit. The ICC arrest warrants make that difficult, given that it's in Korea, which is a ICC signer, but at least I think we should push the idea that this should be on the table between the dialogue between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. So we're just at a great opening for humanity, that if we take the initiative and the lead on this idea that only through peace, through development, whether it's the Oasis Plan or the Bering Strait connection, that's the only way to resolve the global crisis that, again, is the detonator for that crisis is the collapse of the transatlantic system. And this provides a new orientation of economy that is actually, in a financial system that is actually tied to the physical economy, as LaRouche outlined, particularly with his triple curve and so on. But that is has to be the future of humanity, and we intend to make that the future. So stay tuned to the LaRouche organization this week. There will be many more developments, and we will be there as well. Stay tuned to EIR, which, as you may have seen, has a new feature in terms of video presentations that we will be doing, outlining some of the aspects of the Executive Intelligence Review, both the weekly and the daily alert. So stay tuned to both EIR and the LaRouche organization, and